application of game theory, his elaborate plan, thwarted. Alas, however, Rodriguez, and probably the worst mistake of his life, declined the provisional presidency. Batista at this time also met Isabel Malhol, who was the leader of Cuba's peak Labour Confederation. Malhol at this time had been aligned to the Authentico Party and was a staunch anti-communist. In 1943, Cuba had established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet embassy became a base for left-wing operations throughout the Caribbean basin. And due to the existence of the presence of this embassy in Havana, the Cuban Communist Party, the PPS, became one of the best resourced political parties in Cuba. Malhol undoubtedly demanded of Batista that he would recognise his regime and cooperate with him if Batista severed diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, which Batista promptly did. And so accordingly Batista assumed the provisional presidency with Cuba. But ominously, because it fell into Castro's game theory plan, Batista did not stipulate when elections would be held. Castro's reaction to the coup was as hypocritical as it was sinister, hypocritical and disingenuous, because Castro denounced the coup. In denouncing the coup, he denounced the corruption of the Authentico Party, but fell back on his supposed suspicion that he mourned the violation of the 1952 Constitution, even though it had been Castro more than anyone else who put the dynamics in place for such a coup to have occurred. And between March of 1952 and July of 1953, Castro's youth group, the Radical Youth Organisation, which was a faction within the Orthodoxo Party, tried to goad the Batista regime into taking repressive action. And this culminated in July 1953 when Castro led a party of over 70 men to attack the Moncada barracks in the port city of Santiago. Due to the overreaction, and this attack was more comical than heroic, but due to the overreaction of the army commandant, most of these attackers were subsequently massacred. And unfortunately, the head of the Cuban secret police, General Francisco Tripolina, who headed the military intelligence service, the SIM, believing that a conspiracy was in play, had over 200 opponents of the Batista regime rounded up and massacred. Batista himself was not aware of this and certainly did not condone this action. But unfortunately, Batista's failure to rein in the secret police would be a major factor as to why they would later fall from power. Therefore, when Castro was apprehended, great care was taken to ensure that no harm came to him. And in October of 1953, Castro was placed on trial. This trial was similar to Hitler's Beerhall-Putsch trial of 1924, in which Castro utilised his rhetorical talents to denounce the Batista regime. Shrewdly, Batista invoked Jose Marti, who he declared himself to be a disciple of. And for all the passion of Castro's speech, it was actually meticulously pre-rehearsed, with Castro concluding his speech with the famous declaration of "Condemn it does not matter, for history will absolve me." Castro was sentenced to 15 years in imprisonment and sent to the Isle of Pine, to the model prison on the Isle of Pines, where he was treated in a humane fashion. Indeed, he befriended the prison commandant, who foolishly, following Castro's rise to power in 1959, remained behind in Cuba, only to be amongst one of the first people that Castro would have executed. Castro, during this period, also met a delegation led by none other than the Interior Minister. It may seem strange to us that an Interior Minister with senior officials would pay a grovelling visit to a political prisoner. But it should be remembered that with regard to the generation of 1930, most of its members had either spent time in prison, in exile, or both. So it was not considered unusual that one day that Castro might be elected president of Cuba, so it was thought to keep on his best side. Castro's attack and trial in 1953 brought home to Batista that he had to schedule elections, which he did for November of 1954. And in August 1954, a new ruling coalition, the Progressive Coalition, was formed. This was a four-party coalition which was composed of a new ruling party, the Progressive Action Party, as former local government officials who once belonged to the Authentico Party joined this party. The overflow of former local government officials who belonged to the Authentico party, who couldn't be accommodated to this new party, formed another political party called the Cuban Radical Party, while the old Macauista Liberal Party, led by Gus Inclán, Dr. Gus Inclán, entered this coalition, with Batista naming Inclán as his vice presidential running mate, and the old Conservative Party, now known as the Democratic Party, led by Gaston Godoy, entering this coalition. Godoy's party actually had a strong anti-Batista faction within it. Batista, on being nominated for president, handed the presidency of the provisional presidency over to his friend, Andres Domingo, and subsequently campaigned for president. Batista faced off against former President Raul San Martin, who cynically, despite being anti-communist, entered into an alliance with the Cuban Communist Party, which took advantage of the election on the campaign on the ground to proselytise amongst the public. The Authentico's were actually divided as to whether or not to participate, and a wing of the party, loyal to former President Prio Soares, advocated a boycott. The Orthodoxo party was also divided as to whether or not to participate. But a majority faction of this party, led by Royal Chibas, Idi Chibas's younger brother, advocated a boycott, while a minority faction, led by Carlos Marcos Sterling and Emilio Ochoa, advocated participation. But because of the strength because of Royal Chibas's dominance of the Orthodoxo party, this wing of the Orthodoxos didn't put up a presidential candidate. Batista, in campaigning for president, made reference to his positive achievements. These had included, on returning to power, entering into an arrangement with the MSR and UIR gangster groups that they would forego involvement in kidnapping and extortion in return for the government turning a blind eye to its gambling and prostitution activities. And this helped restore a sense of law and order throughout Cuba. Batista also brought in a tax amnesty which bolstered government revenue. And he also successfully negotiated the sale of Cuban sugar to the United Kingdom. Batista was able to legitimately win the presidency with over 80% of the vote against Raul. With those, and although this may sound rigged, those who were opposed to Batista generally did not turn out to vote, and therefore manifested their opposition by a boycott. But the Batista administration nevertheless there was a 52% turnout in this election. And so it all seemed well that when Batista was inaugurated president for a 4-year term in February of 1955, that he would go down in Cuban history as the Luis Monons Marianne of Cuba. Luis Monons had been the leading figure in Puerto Rico, who had thwarted the United States granting independence to this unincorporated American territory in the 1930s. And between 1952 and 1966 had served as governor of Puerto Rico. And during this period had initiated a policy known as Operation Bootstrap, where Puerto Rico integrated with the United States in an economic context, whereby Puerto Rico, despite a scarcity of natural resources, gained the highest standard of living in the Caribbean. I know now that some of you might know that Puerto Rico at the current state is currently an economic basket case. But this does not negate Monon's achievements. And I'd also like to say, if I may, that I think a way around Puerto Rico's current problems would be for that territory to become the United States' 51st state. But that's another issue. And Batista himself could have been the Marines Marianne of Cuba, as he brought in talented technocrats from the old ABC to unveil the policy called the National Economic Policy. This plan opened up foreign investment from West Germany and France into investing into light industry, such as canned food factories. So that Cuba could overcome the perennial problem of unemployment that came with the sugar harvest. Batista also brought in under this plan wage indexation for unionised workers. And I believe that had Batista not fallen from power, that by the 1960s, Cuba, because of this plan, which was the Cuban equivalent of Operation Bootstrap, probably would have had a living standard on a par with that of the American state of Florida. But unfortunately, this economic plan alienated much of the powerful American business community domiciled in Havana, because they felt that their business interests were threatened. And in March 1958, this American lobby based in Cuba would later lobby the Eisenhower administration in March 1958 to make one of the fundamentally worst mistakes in American foreign policy history, that of imposing an arms embargo against the Batista administration. Batista probably would not have had to have confronted a Castro rebellion had he not foolishly released Fidel Castro from prison in May 1955. But this was done on the misassumption that Castro was a Democrat, who are now, having generated so much publicity for himself, seeking a career in electoral politics so that he might later be elected president. But this was not to be. For Castro, soon after his release, departed for the United States, and from there on to Mexico, where he undertook training in guerrilla warfare as part of an uprising that would come against Batista. That such an uprising would come can in part be attributed to former President Prio Soares, who returned to Cuba in August 1955, and with that helped establish a new umbrella opposition group in December 1955 called the Friends of the Cuban Republic, the SAR. And accordingly, negotiations between the SAR, whose secretary was the prominent lawyer Maria Cardona, who was Prio's chief political associate, and the government were commenced in March 1956. Batista expected that with these negotiations, Prio, who had arranged for Batista's return to power in 1952, would come to an agreement where the opposition would accept Batista's legitimacy in power, participate in the 1958 elections, and give a guarantee that should the opposition win those elections, that they will not prosecute former Batista government officials. But from Prio's perspective, who would have voted for his wing of the party, consider its corrupt record in government? Prio therefore proceeded to sabotage these talks by making an unreasonable demand that Batista make way for provisional government. And even had Batista done this, Prio was still unwilling to guarantee an amnesty for former Batista government officials. Prio did this so, knowing that with the breakdown of these talks, the civic dialogue, which later on became known as the Dialogue of the Deaf, that a revolutionary situation would be created, which Prio could later ride by supporting a revolutionary process against Batista, and in the event of Batista falling, that his prestigious supporter, Maria Cardona, would be in a position to lead a rejuvenated Authentico party. The clubs of these talks were sold in the following month of April 1956 in an attempted coup by Prio's supporters within the armed forces. This was crushed and Prio accordingly went into exile. But in December 1956, Fidel Castro, on a yacht named the Granma, which was purchased by Prio's ill-gotten gains, landed in the Oriente province with a party of over 70 people. Batista intelligence agencies had forewarned him of this and had set a trap for this party. And in the ensuing conflict, all but a handful of this party were killed. Incredibly enough, and dare I say, perhaps unfortunately, Fidel Castro was one of the handful that managed to survive. And he then made his way to the remote Sierra Mistera mountainous region. It seemed absurd that Castro from this region, an isolated individual such as himself, would therefore be able to wage a revolution successfully against Batista. And the real beginning of the Cuban Revolution was not so much Castro's landing in the Oriente province in December 1956, but Jose Echeverria's misplaced attack on the presidential palace in March 1957. Jose Echeverria led a student group which after this attack became known as the March 10 Revolutionary Directorate. Echeverria attacked the presidential palace, Echeverria's party attacked the presidential palace, but Batista again was forewarned and most of the attackers were killed. Echeverria himself was killed in an associated attack on a radio station. But this attack marked the point at which Batista commenced his painful descent from power. Because following this attack, a narrative took took form amongst most Cubans that because of this attack and the failure of the civic dialogue talks and Batista having returned to power via military coup in 1952, that Batista was a dictator who could only, similar to Mercado, could only be removed by force. And thus, between 1957 and 1958, Cuba unravelled. As Castro had foreseen as part of his game theory, as the majority of the Cuban population moved against Batista because he'd sown the seeds of distrust by returning to power in a military coup in 1952. Castro, during this time, granted interviews in Sierra Maestra to the New York Times journalist Herbert Matthews, and due to the publicity that Castro received in the Washington Post and the New York Times, a perspective, a notion took hold that Castro was masterminding a revolt against Batista. And during this time, it should be said, allow me to repeat, the Cuban people had embraced a false narrative that Batista was a dictator who could only be removed by force. And similarly false was the perspective that Fidel Castro was a democrat. The fact that he was not was reflected by credible reports from the Sierra Maestra of executions of 26th Movement of July partisans for minor breaches of discipline, and that Fidel Castro insisted upon total obedience over his followers. And this created tension between Castro and the his urban operatives, who were at the forefront of opposing the Batista regime. And this potential division might have been fatal had Castro not turned circumstances to his advantage. In April 1958, liberal elements within Castro's 26th of July movement launched a general strike to bring down Fulgencio Batista. The government's strident actions in crushing this strike led to a vacuum within the 26th of July movement, which was filled by ardent Federalistas and communist members of the PPS. Batista, having crushed this strike, should have, in retrospect, proceeded to have held presidential elections in June, which he brought forward to that month instead of November. Unfortunately, Batista moved the elections back to November and launched an offensive, a general offensive, against Castro in his guerrilla redoubt. That the June 1958 military offensive failed was due to divisions within the Cuban armed forces between army officers loyal to Batista, who were in the minority, and professionally trained officers. And indeed, Castro, in radio broadcasts, had declared his admiration for the officer cause, and in the process did much to undermine army morale. Not only, and this action on Castro's part was all the more sinister when one considers that when he came to power in January 1959, he did so, even though the Cuban army was still intact, it would have stopped him, because he'd been able to psychologically incapacitate the army. And even those officers who maintained their distance from Castro, which thereby allowed him to take victory, would soon fall victim to him, as he had many of them executed. The collapse of the June 1958 offensive seemed to herald Batista's fall from power. But whether Cuba would reach an implosion point really depended on whether the November 1958 general elections gained general legitimacy. And Prio yet again intervened to help ensure Batista's rise to power. This was done by Prio by convening in the Venezuelan capital, Caracas, the assembly of the small L liberal opponents of Batista, who signed what became known as the Pact of Caracas. Under this pact, these Cuban politicians undertook to boycott the November 1958 elections. Prio could have been said in Prio's defence that he might not have known that Castro was actually a communist. But in actual fact, Prio at this gathering half-joked and crudely joked, I won't say what he said, that how adverse the situation would be if Fidel Castro turned out to be a communist. The signatories of the 26th of July of the Pact of Caracas agreed that Castro's designated future provisional president, Judge Manuel Ureta, would be the future president of Cuba. And they made this concession in return for Ureta, with Castro's support, accepting that most signatories of the 26th of the Pact of Caracas would enter the Ureta cabinet. Indeed, Prio's chief political associate, Mario Cardona, was to serve as Ureta's prime minister. Thus, the small L liberals who opposed Fulgencio Batista signed a Faustian pact believing that they'd been able to restrain Fidel Castro. And thus the November 1958 elections took place. The real issue in these elections was not whether or not, was not so much who to vote for, but whether or not to vote, as Fidel Castro had pronounced all-inclusive death sentences against all running candidates. And to show that he meant business, he had the ruling party's brother of the ruling presidential candidate, who despite having once been a friend of his, assassinated. The three opposition candidates in these elections were Raul San Martin, the former president, who had a small but dedicated following. Celaya Saramo, who aspired to be an Authentico Party presidential candidate, but his base was far too small, and Carlos Marquez Sterling, who also claimed to be aspired to be the mantle of the Orthodoxo Party. But most of the Orthodoxo Party, indeed most of the Cuban population, was supportive of Royal Chivas, the younger brother of Eddie Chivas, who unfortunately lent his considerable prestige to an election boycott. The government candidate in these elections was Andres Rivera Aguero, who had actually been a lifelong friend of Fulgencio Batista's, and whose education minister under Batista had ended the colossal corruption that had bedeviled this ministry, and who had honestly served as Prime Minister of Cuba between 1957 and 1958, until in March 1958 the parties of the Progressive Coalition nominated him for president. Rivero named as his running mate the outgoing Speaker of the House of Representatives and leader of the Democratic Party, Gaston Godoy, and the outgoing mayor of outgoing vice president Gus Inclán was named as the coalition's candidate for mayor of Havana. The November 1958 elections have generally been characterised as being rigged, and I would say inaccurately so. This has been because Carlos Marquez Sterling, the main opposition candidate, alleged that they were rigged. And Marquez Sterling was a figure then of considerable prestige, and he previously recognised that Batista had fairly won elections. Marquez Sterling alleged that the government was able to circumvent the protections of the 1943 Electoral Code because in the eastern part of Cuba, due to guerrilla operations, the conduct of the election was thwarted, so that most Cuban voters in the eastern part of the country weren't able to vote. Marquez Sterling alleged that the government took advantage of this by padding the vote by crossing off the names of people who hadn't turned out to vote. And this was also aided by the fact that there were no election monitors. But the low turnout in the east was reflected in the official figures. And there was also a relatively low figure in the western part of Cuba where the elections were conducted smoothly, again because of an opposition call to a boycott. And this boycott took hold, again, because of Raul Chivas, who was the man most Cubans who, had he taken part in this election, would have elected as president. But unfortunately, Royal Chivas had given his support to the Pact of Caracas. Andres Rivero, due to the personal block votes of pro-government local government officials and the election boycott, was able to win the presidency with a plurality of the vote with a 40% turnout. And there's been a perspective that had Rivero assumed the presidency in February 1959, that he would have been a puppet of Fulgencio Batista's. But had Rivero assumed the presidency in February 1959, Batista would have left Cuba of his own accord to go into self-imposed exile. Rivero planned that the second half of 1959, elections would be held to a constitutional convention to revise the Constitution of 1940. Had such elections been held, and had the Orthodoxo Party under the leadership of Royal Chivas participated, there's no doubt this party would have come first, and the Authentico Party probably would have come second, with the Progressive Coalition probably having come in third. Although the Progressive Coalition would have come third, the Liberal Party within this coalition would have remained viable because its leader, Dr. Gus Inclán, would have then been Mayor of Havana, which, as I said, was the second most important position in Cuba after the presidency. Under a revised constitution, elections would have been held in 1960, which undoubtedly would have been won by Royal Chivas, with Dr. Inclán probably coming third. But nevertheless, Batistanos, or neo-Batistanos, would have been able to remain in the Cuban political system by there being a viable liberal party. And it should be said that it was Gus Inclán's plan to hand over leadership eventually of the Liberal Party to Roberto de Aragon. Roberto de Aragon was actually Fulgencio Batista's biological son. He had been the leader of the Mansantes province's branch of the Young Liberals and was a political genius, a protege in his own right. And had he become leader of the Liberal Party in the 1960s, his superlative political talents were such that by the late 1960s, early 1970s, he undoubtedly would have been elected president of Cuba and would have allowed his probable biological father, Fulgencio Batista, to return from exile to Cuba as a private citizen. But whatever game theory Roberto de Aragon might have had, it was Fidel Castro's game theory that was in play, and at this time the majority of the Cuban people were hostile to Fulgencio Batista. Batista, realising this, and the armed forces would probably not fight on his behalf, met with a US State Department employee, William Pauly, to ask that he be granted asylum in the United States. Batista undertook to immediately resign if such asylum was granted, and to make way for a new three-man military junta, one of whose officers would be a Priista officer. So therefore the armed forces, with Prijo's backing, would prevent Castro from coming to power. But the Eisenhower administration, perhaps inexplicably, was hostile to Batista and refused to grant him asylum. Batista therefore decided to try and tough it all out and hold on to the presidency until February of the following year. But in December of 1958, Batista uncovered a plot by General Francisco Tripoliana to arrest him and hand him over to Fidel Castro. And with that, Batista decided to flee into exile. And famously, on New Year's of 1959, at the Columbia Army Barracks, resigned and departed the country by plane. In resigning, Batista designated a judge, Carlos Pedrito of the Supreme Court, to be Cuba's new president. But news of Batista's flight into exile saw a frenzied reaction on the part of the Cuban population, with perhaps over 1 million people in Havana, nearly the entirety of Havana's population turning out, heralding Batista's flight into exile with the chant of "Revolution, yes, military coup, no." Due to this overwhelming manifestation of support for the 1959 revolution, Pedrito gave way to Manuel de Rita, who became Cuba's new provisional president. Manuel Rita established what was Cuba's most talented and honest government, and it seemed that all would be well for Cuba now, as it had an honest government. But alas, what had happened in 1959 was part of Castro's game theory, and did not enter into Castro's calculations that Cuba would now become a functional democracy. Now, President Ureta and Prime Minister Cardona, who was Prijo's chief political associate, might have been able to prevent Castro from establishing a dictatorship had they opposed his policy of mass executions of Batistano officers, and also officers who had kept their distance from Batista, and Batistano politicians. And this policy of mass executions was supported by the rallying cry of "To the Wall." By the fact that Ureta and Cardona had missed the bus with regard to stopping Castro establishing a dictatorship was reflected by Cardona resigning as Prime Minister in February of 1959 and making way for Castro. And in June of 1959, Ureta himself was deposed as President of Cuba and replaced by the communist academic Osvaldo Doctris. The fact that Castro was moving to establish a dictatorship paradoxically created the opportunity for Fulgencio Batista to attempt another political comeback. Batista, on flying out of Cuba, had radioed ahead to the United States asking for asylum, but perhaps predictably enough, this was denied, and the Batista party made their way to the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic was then ruled by the tyrant Rafael Trujillos, with whom Batista had an adversarial relationship. But Trujillos, working on the maxim that my enemy's enemy is my friend, granted Fulgencio Batista asylum. And from the Dominican Republic, Fulgencio Batista planned another invasion of Cuba. But in August 1959, an advanced party of Batistanos, due to internal betrayal, was ensnared in a trap when they landed in the port city of Trinidad. And they were actually personally captured by none other than Fidel Castro. And with that, Fulgencio Batista departed for exile, first on the Portuguese island of Madeira, and from there on to Portugal and later to Spain. As you all probably know, there was another attempted invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles, that of the Bay of Pigs invasion of April 1961. This was undertaken under the auspices of the Cuban Revolutionary Council, which had been formed in March 1961. It was headed by Miro Cardona and was in effect a coalition between the Prios Authenticos, and the People's Revolutionary Movement, which was a left-wing but intensely anti-communist party. I have no doubt that had the Bay of Pigs invasion received air support from the Kennedy administration, that it would have succeeded, and former officials of the Castro regime would have gone into the NPR. So it seemed destined that regardless of whether Castro had fallen from power, that Cuba would have moved, because of the 1952 coup, towards having a left-wing political economy. And as a result of the failure of this invasion attempt, Castro consolidated his power and also vindicated his application of game theory. That Cuba had moved to the left was also reflected in Cuban emigres. Today, when we think of Cuban emigres, or Cuban-American Cubans, it's almost tautological to say that an American Cuban is right-wing. But in the 1960s, most Cuban emigres were actually left of centre. They supported John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1960 over Richard Nixon, and this in part might have been because Kennedy was a Catholic. And they also supported Lyndon Johnson's election to the presidency in 1964. But by 1968, most Cuban exiles in Florida gave their support to Richard Nixon being elected president. And this provided Batista, who was based in Spain, another opportunity to attempt another political comeback. And in 1970, Batista's probable biological son, Roberto de Aragon, and Rafael Diaz-Balart, who had once been Fidel Castro's brother-in-law and head of the PA's youth wing, relaunched the Progressive Coalition. The Progressive Coalition was in effect an amalgamation of the old Progressive Action Party, the Radical Party and the Democratic Party. But this alliance went by the term of coalition because the Liberal Party, still led by Gus Inclán, remained a viable political party. And between 1970 and 1973, the Progressive Coalition clearly emerged as the strongest opposition group in exile to the Castro regime. And Batista himself remained prominent despite being confined to exile in Spain, in Florida, through having a column published in the Floridian Cuban emigre newspaper Patria. And Fidel Castro, perhaps to incapacitate the Progressive Coalition, in August 1973 dispatched two twin brothers, the LaGuardia agents, to have Fulgencio Batista kidnapped and brought back to Cuba for trial and subsequent execution. But mercifully, if not providentially, on the day that the LaGuardia twins arrived in Madrid, Fulgencio Batista died of a heart attack. And perhaps, as Fidel Castro had foreseen, the Progressive Coalition without Fulgencio Batista went into decline. But Roberto de Aragon shrewdly took its remnants into the Republican Party, and this actually helped provide a base for Marco Rubio's subsequent political career, despite the fact that Marco Rubio's parents were anti-Batista. And so it has to be said with regard to Fulgencio Batista, that although his life ended in relative failure, he nevertheless set the precedent for Cuba of having moved the country from being a dictatorship to a democracy following the 1933 revolution. And had he not made the grievous mistake of releasing Fidel Castro from prison in 1955, he might also have an honoured place in Cuban history for having brought that nation economic prosperity and a high standard of living. But nevertheless, despite his fall, as I said, the precedent of Batista taking Cuba from dictatorship to democracy is still worthwhile because it's one to be emulated. I'd like to conclude by saying that considering Fidel Castro's political genius, it was not only natural that he not only dominate Cuba domestically, but have an impact on the world when it came to international relations. And it can be said without a shadow of a doubt that Cuba during the Cold War was the Soviet Union's most important ally. I could give a talk in its own right, which would probably bore you, about how Fidel Castro was able to adversely impact upon nearly every country within Latin America, and how he established significant influence in Africa. Indeed, as an aside, I'd like to say that Fidel Castro's friend, Joe Slovo, the leader of the South African Communist Party, in April 1994, almost provoked a right-wing military coup in South Africa so as to abort the May 1994 general elections, which ended apartheid. Had such a coup occurred, there no doubt would have been a communist-led revolution which would have established a Marxist-Leninist state in South Africa. Cuba's also had an impact on countries as far as wide as Australia, as there's a left-wing Marxist group called Resistance, which draws its inspiration from Cuba. And even in the United States, there's a left-wing youth social movement, the Occupy movement, which is in part directed by the youth wing of the Communist Party, or the Communist Party of the United States, which has close links to Cuba. So therefore, I'd like to conclude with the question, perhaps the rhetorical question of Cubatus. Where to now for Cuba? As you all probably know, President Obama is visiting Cuba in the next month. I don't know with regard to President Obama, because I think he's an ambiguous figure. I don't know whether this is a manifestation on his part of naivety, or perhaps him having a sinister left-wing agenda, or again, perhaps a shrewd masterstroke on his part. I just don't know. But I would warn against the United States having close relations with Cuba, because Cuba will undoubtedly place restrictions on American diplomats being able to link up with Cuban dissidents, and most dissident groups in Cuba are ineffective because they've been infiltrated by the secret police. And at the same time, Cuba will undoubtedly establish consulates in the United States and try and cultivate a left-wing social political movement in the United States. But I would like to say about Cuba, if you look at Cuban history, the fact of the matter is, going back to the Platte Republic, there's always been a fear on the part of Cuban governments. Problems have emerged when Cuban governments have been worried about ceding power to the opposition. Batista gained great kudos for making way for the opposition in 1942, and in 1952, essentially, it was Prio who didn't want